how to stop playing the blame game. In other words, how to stop blaming yourself and blaming others when life does not go your way or really bad things happen. Let me just acknowledge I fully understand the reason that we get into blaming ourselves or blaming other people, and terrible things in life happen. I was working with a startup founder the other day, and they had a an app that taught people about forgiveness. And it was really interesting because I thought that was pretty bold in terms of not just teaching people about forgiveness, but going in and teaching people at work about forgiveness and how it would impact productivity, teamwork, conflict resolution, creativity, innovation, all that good stuff, morale, culture. And so I've encountered enough people throughout my days as I go through my weeks who are experiencing either they are blaming other people and, to be direct, acting like big fat victims, or they are blaming themselves and being big fat victims, or they're getting victimized by allowing other people to blame them. It's a really interesting thing. And so people get caught in this vicious cycle. And so I thought we could just talk about it and talk about the blame game. And the reason it's so important is because when we blame or we allow ourselves to be blamed, we get stuck in bitterness and we lose the ability to forgive. And when you refuse to forgive either other people or yourself, and many people don't consider forgiving themselves at all, which I'll get into in a moment. I've had it taught to me that it's like drinking poison and waiting for the other person to die, and or expecting the other person to die. And obviously that's not going to work. And the effect of unforgiveness and bitterness in our lives, in our relationships, mental health, and our physical bodies, it's been proven, it's been tracked by science. There is lots of evidence all over the place what happens. So let me go through a quick study or an explanation on the blame game and how it sort of works. So there's two extremes when it comes to the blame game. So I'm going to put blame game, and there's two extremes here this way. And on one extreme, it is blame others. And this is when we get into victim mentality, where it's everybody else's fault. And you just go into that victim identity. And that represents an external locus of control, which is, I am not the one responsible for these results. Everybody else did this to me. And that is just not a good place to be. There's actually a condition called victim narcissism or victim-based narcissism. I hope I'm getting that right, where someone actually, has such a grandiose view of themselves that they're constantly painting themselves out to be victim. I'm always being victimized. And you've seen cases like this in the media. I'm not going to mention them, but where it's everybody else's fault. People are doing this to me. And then there's this side where it's blame self. And this is where people I see are victimized and they're under their own self-condemnation. And it's all my fault, all my fault, all my fault. And how did it get there? Well, guess what? Most likely this individual has allowed themselves to be victimized, and it's all a two-way street. This happens to everybody in different forms, but you can be on one side, but little do people know you're actually struggling with the other side as well. So let me explain something here. Is so when I see someone who's always blaming others, they have a problem forgiving themselves. So forgive self. In other words, they can get into a place where they have such shame, and the only way to cope with it, instead of turning and saying, this is my fault, they have to blame others. So they're struggling with self-forgiveness. And then a lot of times when people are blaming themselves and they're being victimized, they have a problem forgiving others. Now, we all have to do both. We're in this middle zone here where it can go one way or the other. And often what happens is we blame others so we can make them look bad, so they can look, so that we can look good. So make somebody else bad so we can look good. But then also when we're blaming ourselves, what happens is we make ourselves bad in order to get other people to help us to feel good or to make us look good. It's sort of an insidious trap. So think about it for a second. A lot of people go and they blame themselves and this and that. And what's happening is they're trying to get people to be on their side by saying, look at me, I'm making myself bad, and getting sympathy and pity. And what happens is if you actually just forgave the other person, then you're fine. You actually release them and you don't have to be victimized by them. It takes away their power to victimize you. And the same goes for when you're blaming others. If you forgive yourself, guess what? You have nothing to hold against yourself. You're not under your own indictment, and you don't have to blame others. You don't have to blame others because you realize, you forgive yourself, take responsibility. I'm the one that put myself in a situation where I have been affected by others in that way. So how do we do this? How do we get to the point where we blame, or we stop playing the blame game and we forgive ourselves? And so I'm going to give you the formula that I use. Okay, so when it comes to forgiveness, so here's what happens. So basically, I take inventory and I say, this is who is in debt because something has happened that's caused somebody to lose something or be cheated. Like there's been some type of transaction that has occurred where someone's in debt. Now, are they officially in debt? It might be just in your mind. But so, for example, if someone has actually wronged you, I have to take inventory and stop and go, okay, that other person owes me a debt. They've done this horrible thing to me, and now they owe me. They've taken something from me. And so that happens there. But then also what happens is when you're in a situation where you're blaming yourself, you can take inventory and say, I have put someone at risk, or I am in debt to that person. So you have to take inventory. And the most important thing about this is that it needs to be appropriate. And often we do not have the ability to know what is appropriate or not. So I remember there was a time I was under so much self-condemnation because people were blaming me because I lost a lot of money in a business and the business tanked, and people blamed me and said some really horrible things. They victimized me, but I kept blaming myself. And I realized, you know what? It's not appropriate for me to take on all that debt. I don't owe them. They invested and they took the risk to invest in my company. Obviously, had I cheated them or I had embezzled money or different things, then I should be held accountable. But there were things definitely that I did that I took responsibility for. And my debt was, I owed everybody an apology and I owed everybody the transparency, the mistakes that I made, but I didn't owe them anything beyond that because it was not appropriate. And so who is in debt? And remember, there's always two sides to every coin. I was taught a long time ago, no matter how flat you squish this pancake, there's two sides to every story. So I'm going to take inventory appropriately and say, wait a second, who actually is in debt here? Right? And then I'm going to empathize. I'm going to empathize versus sympathize. And there's a difference. Empathy is putting yourself in the other person's shoes and feeling bad because you can imagine how they feel bad. So you put yourself in other shoes and you can imagine how they feel bad, and you go, oh, okay, I can definitely feel what they're feeling because they put themselves in their shoes. Sympathizing or sympathy is I feel bad because the other person feels bad. And it lacks the cognitive ability, the emotional intelligence to put yourself in the other person's shoes. You just feel bad because it appears that they're feeling bad. And so sympathy is very shallow. Sympathy is very important. It's an important emotion. And to show other people sympathy, it's really important. For example, if you saw someone and you saw that they had a close family member pass away, well, that's okay to show sympathy and just say, I feel really bad because you're feeling bad right now. But then you have to follow up with empathy, because here's what happens when you're experiencing sympathy, you want to fix your own pain. And a lot of times what happens is by trying to fix your own pain, you try and fix the other person, and that's inappropriate. So if you empathize, you can say, all right, so I feel bad because they feel bad. You have sympathy. But then you empathize and say, okay, let me put myself in their shoes. Do we really need to fix this pain right now? For example, if someone has passed away, there's a time where you need grieving, or someone has lost their company. There's a time where people need grieving versus, oh, I'm just going to go fix it for you, etc. It might be completely inappropriate. You might end up rescuing them, enabling dysfunction. So you want to empathize as much as possible. So put yourself in the other person's shoes and say, what are they experiencing? And what have they gone through with that debt? Either they have done something bad to you. So I did this with my parents. I put myself in their shoes and I tried to envision what they must be going through for them to make the certain choices as I was growing up that caused me trauma, right? And at the same time, I empathize with the people where I made mistakes. I'm blaming myself. But what happens is I put myself in their shoes and imagine what they're feeling, what they're experiencing. And I go empathy, but I stay away from sympathy because I don't want to feel bad just because they feel bad. I want to feel what they're feeling and envision what they're feeling because I put myself in their shoes. But I hold the line. And I go, if I go into sympathetic pains, that can be very inappropriate. So you're naturally going to feel sympathy, but use empathy to regulate that. And then the last final step is I realize, I accept, and forgive the debt. So what happens is I just accept it. And a lot of times acceptance requires appreciation. So you just can appreciate the situation that everybody else was in. You can accept it, but true empathy allows you to appreciate without having to fix it. Now, I'm not saying that there aren't situations where there aren't situations where you're going to be called to fix things and make restitution. Absolutely. But I'm just talking about the mental and the emotional exercise of forgiveness. So you appreciate without having to fix the time being. Now, later on, if you're moved to doing or taking action, that's very important. I suggest you do so, but not until you're in the right headspace. So, for example, if someone has done something to me, like, for example, my parents, I accepted that it happened. I accepted that they can't pay the debt. They're not going to be able to go back. We're not going to go back in time, when I'm a baby or 5 years old and they made the decisions. And I appreciate without having to fix, without having to go back in time. I just say, you know what? I accept that that's the choice they made. And I appreciate that they were in the situation because I've empathized that they've made it. and I don't have to fix them. I don't have to fix them whatsoever. I don't have to fix my parents. My parents and I have a great relationship now because I'm not trying to fix them anymore. And so the other side of it is when I'm being blamed, and I have been a leader and I've made decisions that have lost lots of people money. I can appreciate that they trusted me, and I accept that they made those decisions, and I don't have to fix that. I don't have to fix their decision making. They're the ones that made decision. Now, if I lied and I coerced them, that's a completely different issue. And then so when I forgive their debt, instead of just forgiving them, so I'll forgive them because usually what happens if they've said some horrible things to me and I'll forgive them. But then what I'll do is I will then forgive myself. So you'll have to forgive others and self. And you're going to do this in both instances. Forgive all the other people who've wronged you either out of their pain, or you've empathized, or their maliciousness. Okay. I accept, I appreciate, and I forgive that they're never going to be able to pay me back. They're not going to go back and, and they may not pay me back because they don't want to. And that's fine. I accept that. But I forgive myself. I forgive myself for putting myself in those situations, making those choices, because guess what? I've empathized and I've been appropriate about it. And I find out, listen, it's not all my fault. It takes two people to tango often. This is where we come into codependent relationships and situations where there's drama triangles, and it takes multiple people to dance. It takes two to tango, so they say. And so what happens is I stop, and because I've been appropriate about it, then I can release myself into my own forgiveness. This is what technique that I've learned. So after I've cleared everything out with the other people, then I stop and I say, I release myself into my own forgiveness. Now, let me tell you something that really helps is to find a proxy to forgive you. So one time, and I'll get very personal, one time I took out a friend and we ordered a pizza, and I told her all the really horrible things that I had done to other people. There's a time in my life where, wow, I was in debt to a lot of people about the horrible things that I'd done, especially women. And so I sat with her and I talked to her and I shared with her and took responsibility. And she said, I forgive you. And there was nothing between me and her, but she stopped and she said, you've been a friend and I know you're sincere and I forgive you. And there's no way she can't come in and stand in place of all those other people, but just having her forgive me and acknowledging where I'm at and where I am, then it helped me move forward, helped me release myself in my own forgiveness. I could forgive myself. I did the same thing when the business went really wrong, and I was in a situation I had lost just as much and more than the investors. I lost my house, and telling my wife, the bank owns our house. We don't own our house anymore. I couldn't get it back. And that was a tough one. And so one of my friends, he actually, kind of forgave me by saying, you have done nothing that other business leaders haven't done on their road to being successful. All business leaders fail. And he just said, let's move on. And he gave me permission to forgive myself. Now, are there people who are still really upset and angry with me? Absolutely, there are. Some people just have not gotten over it. But that's going to eat away at them. They're drinking the poison and expecting me to die. Oh, and they've let me know. But that's not appropriate for me to take that upon myself. And so I have clarified who's in debt, where, but I've forgiven them for attacking me. So that's how this all works, is understand that when you're playing the blame game, whether you're on the other side, it usually is you're blaming others because you're struggling with blaming yourself. And then also you're struggling blaming yourself because you haven't forgiven other people for victimizing you. So take some time and consider those implications and go through those steps, take inventory. And like I said, I suggest going through it with a friend, maybe watching this video together and then talking it through and going through these steps. A lot of people do these steps in different ways. They go out to a retreat, or they write things down, or they just spend some time. They write letters to the people and never send them. Things like I've done all these things, and you can have it facilitated, but reflect on it and let me know how it goes.